SABC, host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025.
Welcome back to the Nasrec Expo Center. This, of course, is where we're broadcasting from. We're going to be stationed here literally 24 hours for the next 2 days. We're not going to be switching off anything until this is finished. And I can tell you it's a hive of activity now. So you can see the media arriving in their droves, all of the different representatives as well that are here reporting on this and part of delegations. Certainly not the leaders. The leaders go somewhere completely different. They're a bit further away from where we are. And we should be expecting, I'm going to talk you through what is going to be happening throughout this morning and the discussions that are going to take place in the respective plenaries. So just to let you know that obviously the road closures they started at about 7 o'clock. That's to ensure that the delegations and the leaders can get here. And they are expected to start arriving at about 8:30 this morning. They've put an hour for those arrivals. 8:30 to 9:30 is where we should start seeing the red carpets taking place and these leaders walking into the summit. Then at 10 o'clock in the morning is when our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, should be getting up and doing that opening session. So this is where we are going to obviously hear the agenda that will be set in motion. Now, the closed sessions that take place, and let me just let you into the discussions that will be happening. These are things that we're not going to be able to broadcast live, but they will be taking place. There are times where cameras need to be switched off at that time. In session 1, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, leaving no one behind, build our economies, the role of trade, financing for development, and the debt burden. Those are the things that are expected to be on the agenda for session 1. They're presentations of the recommendations from the Africa Expert Panel, the Extraordinary Committee of Independent Experts on Global Wealth and Inequality, and that's what is expected to happen in that first session. Moving on to session 2 now, in that other closed session that will be taking place, there's also other issues that will be taking center stage, and those are them: the resilient world, disaster risk reduction, climate change, just energy transition, and food systems. Then, of course, the third session. That's another one that's under focus, and this is what's under discussion: a fair and a just future for all critical minerals, decent work, and artificial intelligence. Massive presentation of the recommendations from the G20 at 20 review, and the adoption of the Johannesburg Leaders Summit outcome document is what's hopefully going to happen after that, but that's scheduled for tomorrow. So I hope that's given you a little bit more insight into what will be discussed over these next 2 days. I've got amazing analysts with us now this morning, sitting with us at the desk. Of course, Dr. Sithembile Mbete, who's the Executive Director of the Public Affairs Research Institute, and Dr. Lebohang Pheko, a Senior Research Fellow and Political Economist. Ladies, a pleasure, always a pleasure to learn and listen to both of you. So I want to just talk a little bit about what we've gone through, because there are high-level discussions that are going to be taking place, and many center around some of the priorities that you outlined to me of what you're hoping to hear. So let me begin with you, Dr. Pheko. Digitalization, the power of data and the global gaps. What are we looking there? Because there is major transformation that is needed when we talk about digitalization. What are we hoping comes out of this?
There are a few things. I mean, I think when we think about this whole notion of the digital infrastructure, we also have to think around data governance and surveillance. And so one of the things is to countervail the power of big tech, and predominantly big tech is from the United States and increasingly from China as well. It also impacts on questions of where our data is actually stored, the security of that data. Our day-to-day lives are a constant play of surveillance of one kind or another, right? Our fingerprints, our eye pupils when you go into an airport, and so on. And we saw this increasingly even during the COVID pandemic, didn't we? Where this was then used to surveil us. We see it also with the algorithmic biases that we receive. You look up one thing and then, you get 10 other suggestions unsolicited. And of course, we are often giving away our data without knowing. And what the concern for many African countries and, across India and many countries of the majority world is that because this data is stored externally, we don't have control over it. And we also don't know why it's being used. And we've seen in the past, of course, that the militarization of data is also a whole new thing.
Yeah, I want to bring the African perspective into this because how do we find a seat at that table? Because if you look at where Africa is, I mean, we literally control less than 1% of the global data in this world.
Do we want a seat or do we actually want to create a whole new table? Because I'm not really sure that our aspiration is to become an invasive, predatory company like a Google, with all due respect. I don't know if that's really what we really want. What those kind of companies have done is to completely monopolize data knowledge, data access, and data application in ways that have crushed innovation. They have crushed any new entrants. And we see that the whole space for innovation in 4IR, such as it is, and the digital world, we see things like the M-Pesa example as exceptions rather.
Yeah.
And yet if we had the space to innovate, we would then be able to rethink and reimagine what our own data landscape needs to look like. And bear in mind that we live in a continent where 60% of people cannot even afford to buy a basic data bundle.
Yeah, and you raise such an important aspect. Let me bring you into this because I think if we can linger on this for just a little bit of time, but perhaps take a different avenue, because if we look at the scramble for critical minerals at this point in time, critical minerals and digital supply chains, is Africa entering the digital economy as a producer, or are we still in the box of being a consumer?
Well, we are in two things. Firstly, we're a source of raw materials.
Yeah.
So it's continuing these colonial relations of exploitative, extractive primary relations with the continent, where it is our minerals and our mineral wealth that then contributes to building the devices that we all use, all of the infrastructure that's then created and shaped elsewhere, that informs the apps that are used in all of these programs,
and then we buy it back. It's the same story.
And so it's not this
not
time.
right.
It's not coffee. It's not cocoa. It's not cotton. But it is. It's these minerals that then make us, buy back all of the tech infrastructure and also the programs, the apps and everything that then shape the world in so many ways, as Lebohang had said. And so part of the transformation needs to be about making Africa a productive player in the game, not just at the point of the raw materials, but also at actually building the digital infrastructure itself.
Because that's a fundamental problem. It's something we've been complaining about for I don't know how long. When we're mining gold, we buy it back. Diamonds, we buy it back. We provide it, but we don't get wealthy enough on it. The people of the continent don't. So there is, of course, this digitalization that we're sitting on, where we're becoming a new frontier for global inequality. And that's what it feels when we're sitting here on the continent. And there's a massive risk, a digital apartheid, if you want to call it that, in another word, unless, of course, governance frameworks changes. What should South Africa and perhaps the continent be pushing for in these discussions and when we talk about this kind of thing?
So we need to rethink that, when we're talking about digital infrastructure, it can't just be all about trying to compete with big tech and become, Afri-tech per se. We also have to think about the functionality, the day-to-day functionality of, for example, making it easier to access social wages, social grants, making it easier, cutting down the queues for people who live in inaccessible areas, even within peri-urban areas, rural areas, who have to queue for hours and hours to go and get their SASA and so on. It has to be really a function of increasing democratization of data access and digital access. And I'm a big proponent of, digital democracy.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really where we ought to be going. If we also consider the things around digital, identity, the way that we make payments and so on, and the transaction costs, those should ideally be contained within our own countries. And those clouds are not these abstract places. Those are power bases. They're centers of power, they're centers of surveillance, they're also centers of potential intrusion as well. And they're also centers of profit, because it also costs us, as Tess says, to buy back a lot of our own data. So we really need to be thinking about digital governance as expanding the digital divide and ensuring that, because we've been talking about bridging the digital divide for years, and yet, every now and again we hear, data must fall, and then on the same hand, we also then want robots to do our work for us. These ideas cannot exist concurrently. There's an illogic to all of that.
There really
Just
is.
to build on something, I think that the ownership of all of these structures becomes very, very important. There's a big push right now to build data centers on the African continent. I mean, South Africa, I think, has 4 or 5 big AI data centers that have been built in the last few years, and where it's just these like warehouses full of computers that are driving. We talk about the cloud as if it's this amorphous thing in the sky, but it's a physical place of computers, of supercomputers that work all day, every day, but consume a huge amount of water and electricity in order to be able to function in those ways. But everything that comes out of that whole infrastructure is then owned elsewhere. It's owned by American companies and fewer Europeans, but then also Asian companies that are basing the underlying physical infrastructure here, and so they're using the commodities that are required from the African continent, but we don't have any ownership over both the infrastructure and also what it enables.
Amazing.
And so having those questions and those conversations, I think, is critical.
It's a very important one. I love this topic, and I think it's such a good one. I know we want to add to it, but can I jump onto inequality? Because everything you're talking about is also adding to the conversation of inequality. And I think inequality is an incredibly important aspect, because that is a theme that we have emphasized that we want to follow as a country. Then we put together this report that talks to that World Inequality Lab, saying 83% of countries live under high inequality, and the top 1% captured 41% of all of the global wealth. So we know the findings of this, which are incredibly disturbing. Does the G20, does this meeting, does the bringing of these minds together honestly have the legitimacy to fix this problem that we are basically seeing that a lot of the members of the G20 are actually contributing to? Do you want to begin with that?
Well, look, I think that, South Africa's big contribution to the G20, amongst them, is this inequality report. It's the first report commissioned by the G20 to study inequality as a systemic and a structural problem that hadn't happened before within the G20. And it is, in some ways, the culmination of the 4 G20 meetings that we've seen that have been hosted by the Global South, so Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, which are all countries that are grappling with the effect of inequality, not just on their economies, but also on society. So putting this issue onto the agenda of the G20 in the first place, I think, has been a really important contribution. Of course, what's going to need to be determined is how then is this report integrated into the G20's work, into the different working groups over the next few years, and whether that actually does happen. Because it is in those working groups that you get the kind of conversation that then leads to the policy outcomes that then can actually start shifting things. And a really powerful conclusion of the report is that, inequality is a policy choice. That governments have taken certain decisions, have adopted certain policies around taxation, around redistribution, around IP, around intellectual property, around innovation, that enforce and entrench, around housing, health, that enforce and entrench inequality, and that they could choose choose to do differently. And so having a coordinated multilateral system and discussion or mechanism of how to enable different policy choices in countries, I think is a valuable contribution that's been made in this G20. But of course, we've yet to see what the political will is to continue the discussion.
That's the thing, and I want to come to you on this. It's the political will. And I suppose from my mind, the question is, can inequality really be treated as a genuine priority, a global priority, when sitting at the table are the biggest emitters, polluters, capital holders, and at the same time, they're the biggest decision makers?
The naughtiest people. I mean, there are a few things. I want to pick up on what Tay was saying as well around what this means in the context of almost a manufactured complicity of in inequality, the production of inequality as an industry, actually, and a policy industry for that matter. So there's tax reforms. I mean, I think one of the pieces around the G20 is that it speaks around the solidarity for SDGs, which, of course, as with many of these global undertakings, hopelessly adrift of its objectives and of meeting any of its targets. But, most countries have a leverage of fiscal policy space and redistributive power to enable things to enable different kinds of resources, human resources, financial resources, digital resources, to be distributed so that we can begin to close the inequality gaps and to move the most dispossessed people much closer to the center. So we do have things, basic things that we've done as a country, gender responsive budgeting, for example. There are things around the social care economy, which is part of the big frameworks at the moment: social reproduction, subsidized care, subsidized housing, subsidized healthcare, and social protection ceilings and social protection floors, so that we don't have the situation of just talking about people falling out of this net. The net is something that the state fixes. The net is something that the state has the infrastructure and the wherewithal to construct in a way that nobody is falling randomly out of this, right? The other piece, of course, is around tax reforms, and this report is incredibly helpful in reminding us, of course, that the rich are getting richer and the most indigent remain, very much dispossessed and very much marginalized. But there are ways even there. I mean, there's another recent survey that has just, I think Oxfam, that has indicated that, at least 70% of millionaires and billionaires, of high wealth individuals, have said that they would be willing to pay an increased tax. So this idea that the wealthy are entirely unwilling. I mean, a 2% isn't much, but are entirely unwilling to make a further contribution isn't entirely true. So I think that's quite hopeful. But I also believe that we also need to begin to, that this summit has the opportunity to begin to pull back on tax holidays and ensure that, multinationals and your big corporates, big tech, and so on, also become decent corporate citizens, because it's well and good to ask ordinary people, the yous and the me's and the people who are usually overtaxed. In fact, the most indigent people are the most overtaxed as well, in terms of time, in terms of food, in terms of transport, and of course, what we pay as a tax base. The wealthiest are the least taxed, commensurate to their income and to their historical intergenerational asset base, right? So there are other ways that the government can legislate the different tax models that we can. So I refuse to believe that, we're in this helpless free fall where the markets must dictate what is available to citizens, when states should be behaving like states.
Yeah,
and I think,
interesting.
Yeah, and I think that what's been really interesting, and I think we've seen this trend accelerate since the COVID pandemic, is the trends that were most associated with the global majority, with the global south, with the developing world in terms of income inequality and wealth inequality, are now being seen acutely in the global north,
Absolutely.
in the developed world. So you've seen in many developed countries a huge increase in income inequality, as well as in wealth inequality, and a rising number of their society who aren't able to look after their basic needs. Food insecurity, you've seen healthcare outcomes decline, education outcomes decline. And so what you are seeing is that this issue being framed not just as one of inequality between states, but actually the question of inequality within states and its effect on governance, on democracy, the rise in populism that we're seeing all over the world can all be linked to these growing gaps between the rich and the poor within states, even rich states. And so that the idea that this is something that needs to be dealt with collectively is really important.
I need to take a break very quickly, but you're making me think of the issue of multilateralism as well, because and let me very quickly ask you this question: with the US boycotting this summit, which they've been very vocal about, which has given it that little dark cloud over it, and they're publicly berating South Africa's presidency, what message does this send about the future of multilateralism?
Well, I think that the presence of other world leaders that have come anyway, that haven't taken the bait of the US in terms of boycotting this summit, that are engaging fully, says that multilateralism continues.
Exactly.
It can be damaged, weakened, threatened at different points, but that the importance of the meeting, of the diplomacy, of these actions of diplomacy is incredibly important as we enter a far more multilateral distribution of power.
Absolutely, and perhaps the old order is breaking down. There you go. There we go. Nice note to leave it on for this one. I know we're going to have you ladies back. Thank you so much for your time. I know we had so much more we wanted to speak about, but a really interesting discussion about some of these different plenaries and things that hopefully are going to come out of this. All right, let's quickly take a break here on the program. We'll see you after this.